Eleanor Whitfield stood on the curb in her own driveway and watched two men in matching polo shirts carry her mother's oak dining table out of the house she had lived in for 31 years. She hadn't even signed the last page yet. The ink on her signature was still wet in the folder under her arm, and already the moving truck's engine was running. Already a stranger in a clipboard vest was tapping a red sticker to the leg of a chair that used to be hers. "Ma'am, you'll want to step back from the truck," the mover said, not unkindly, just tired, like he'd said it to 100 women standing in 100 driveways watching their lives get boxed up. Eleanor stepped back. She was 61 years old and she had nowhere to stand. If you're anything like the thousands of people who have messaged me about stories like this one, you already know the feeling of watching something get taken from you piece by piece while everyone around you calls it fair. Hit subscribe right now, because what happens to Eleanor over the next few weeks is the kind of reversal you will not want to miss. And I promise you, this is only the beginning. Richard hadn't come to watch. That was the part that strung more than the sticker on the chair leg. 34 years of marriage, and he couldn't even show up to see the last of it carried out the door. He'd sent a text instead. "Movers are scheduled for 9. Try not to make it difficult." As if her standing quietly on the curb while strangers hauled away her mother's furniture was somehow the difficult version of this. "Where's the rest of it going?" she asked the mover. "Storage, ma'am. 60 days, then it's auctioned if nobody claims it." He didn't say who told him to say that. He didn't have to. Eleanor got into her car, the only thing in the settlement that hadn't required an argument, a 9-year-old Subaru with a check engine light that had been on since spring, and she drove. She didn't decide where. Her hands decided for her, turning left instead of right at the end of the street, taking the old route out past the highway toward the 2-lane road that wound up through Ashford County, the road that led to the one place in the world Richard Whitfield had never once set foot. Her mother's bakery. Rosalind Callahan had run Sweetwater Bakery for 38 years before her hands got too shaky to pipe frosting and her mind got too foggy to remember which oven ran hot. She died 6 years ago, and the bakery had sat closed ever since, the lease technically still in Eleanor's name because nobody had ever bothered to cancel it. Taxes paid out of a savings account Richard didn't know existed because he'd never asked what she did with the money her mother left her. He'd always said it wasn't worth discussing. "It's a shuttered storefront in a town with 4 stoplights, Eleanor. It's not an asset. It's a liability with a sentimental attachment." That's what he told the judge's clerk when they filed the disclosure paperwork. A liability with a sentimental attachment. He hadn't even bothered fighting for it. She parked outside the bakery an hour later, engine ticking as it cooled, and sat there staring at the dust-caked windows and the faded gold letters, SWEETWATR Bakery, EST, 1985, and the closed sign that had been flipped to that side of the glass since the week her mother's hands stopped working right. She thought about turning around. She thought about the fact that she had $430 in her checking account and a car with a warning light and absolutely no plan beyond driving somewhere Richard's voice couldn't follow her. Then she got out of the car and unlocked the door. Dust hung in the afternoon light like something suspended in water. The display case was empty except for a single tray liner, brittle and yellowed. The big steel mixer her mother had bought second-hand in 1991 sat under a sheet in the corner, and when Eleanor pulled the sheet back, she found her mother's handwriting taped to the side of it in blue ink gone soft with age. "Bertha, be gentle with her, she's older than you think." Eleanor laughed out loud in the empty room, and then the laugh turned into something else, something that had been building since the courthouse, and she sat down on an overturned crate behind the counter and cried the way she hadn't let herself cry in front of Richard's lawyer, in front of Richard, in front of anyone. When she was done, she wiped her face with the back of her hand and noticed something she hadn't seen from the doorway, a loose floorboard behind the register, the exact width of a shoebox, with one corner worn smooth from being lifted 1,000 times. She pried it up. Inside was a metal recipe box, the kind with a hinged lid and a little brass latch, and beneath it, a bank envelope, unopened, addressed to Eleanor in her mother's handwriting, postmarked 2 weeks before Rosalind died. She hadn't known this existed. In 6 years of grief and paperwork, and Richard telling her not to bother going through all that. She had never once been told there was a letter waiting for her under the floor of her mother's bakery. Her hands were shaking again, but for a different reason now. Stay with me here, because the next part of this story is the reason people keep coming back to this channel. Comment Sweetwater below if you're rooting for Eleanor already, and make sure that like button is hit before we go any further, because what's inside that envelope changes everything. She slid her finger under the flap. Ellie, it began, in the loose cursive her mother had used only in private, never on the bakery's chalkboard signs. If you're reading this, it means I never got around to telling you in person, which means I ran out of time, which is the one thing your grandmother always warned me about. Don't run out of time the way I did. I never told you the bakery turned a profit every single year I ran it, even the bad ones. I never told you because your father before he passed, and then Richard after, both had a way of making a woman's money feel like it belonged to whoever asked about it loudest. So I kept it quiet. There's more in the recipe box than recipes, Ellie. There's the ledger. There's the deed to the lot next door, the one I bought off old Mr. Petrakis in '99 for almost nothing because everybody thought this street was dying. It isn't dying, baby. It's just resting. I always knew somebody would come along and want that corner someday. I just didn't know it'd be you who needed it to be worth something. Don't let anyone tell you this place is a liability. Your grandmother built this recipe with her own hands in a kitchen with a dirt floor, and I built a business out of it. And if you ever need it, it's yours, whole, no strings, no explanations owed to anybody who didn't stand behind that counter with us. I love you more than butter loves sugar, which is the only kind of love I know how to write down. Mama. Eleanor sat on the crate holding the letter until the light through the windows turned orange, then grey, then gone. She opened the recipe box. Underneath the index cards, her grandmother's crumb cake, her mother's sourdough starter instructions, a cinnamon roll recipe with a coffee stain shaped like a thumbprint, was a ledger, and beneath the ledger, a folded deed, and beneath the deed, a savings passbook from a credit union 2 towns over with a balance that made Eleanor sit up straight and read the number twice. Her mother hadn't been running a shuttered storefront with a sentimental attachment. Her mother had been sitting on nearly a quarter of a block of Main Street, quietly, for over 2 decades, and had never told a soul because the men in her life had trained her not to. Eleanor thought about Richard, standing in the settlement meeting saying the words not worth discussing about a place he'd never once walked into. She started laughing again, and this time it didn't turn into crying. The next morning she called a locksmith to rekey the front door, a cleaning crew to handle the dust and the mouse droppings in the back stockroom, and a man named Gus Alvarez who used to fix ovens for her mother, retired now but willing, he said, for Rosalind's girl always. Word moves fast in a town with 4 stoplights. By the second day, a young woman named Priya showed up at the door asking if the rumors were true, if Sweetwater was really reopening, because she'd been laid off from the chain bakery 2 towns over after they cut her hours to avoid paying benefits. And she had 2 kids and a car payment and hands that, she said, just know how to work a proof box. I promise you, give me a shift and I'll show you. I can't pay much yet, Eleanor told her, honestly, because she still hadn't touched the number in that passbook, not until a lawyer told her it was safe to. I don't need much, Priya said. I need somewhere that doesn't treat me like a line item. Eleanor hired her on the spot. They spent the next 2 weeks scrubbing, painting, testing Bertha the mixer, who groaned back to life on the 3rd try like she'd only been sleeping. Gus got both ovens firing evenly within a temperature range Eleanor's mother would have approved of. Eleanor pulled her grandmother's crumb cake recipe and made a test batch that filled the whole block with a smell that brought 3 separate retirees to the door before the sign even said open. If this story is hitting you the way it's hitting me, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because I read every single one, and hit subscribe now if you haven't, because Richard is about to find out exactly what he let his lawyers dismiss as worthless, and it does not go the way he expects. It took 11 days for the phone call to come. I heard you reopened Sweetwater, Richard said, the way he might mention hearing about a stock he used to own. Word travels. I also heard the town's putting through a rezoning package for that stretch of Main. Mixed-use retail corridor. There's a developer already circling. Elena said nothing, because she already knew, because the developer circling had left a card in her mailbox 2 days earlier offering an eye-watering number for the corner lot, the one her mother had bought off Mr. Petrakis for almost nothing. That property's worth a lot more than either of us realized when we settled, Richard said. I think it's fair we revisit that. Well, the house was worth more than the appraisal too, if we're being honest, Elena, and I never asked you to pay me back for the difference. I think there's room for us to be reasonable adults about this. You didn't ask me about the house because you got the house, Richard. There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that in 34 years of marriage she'd learned to read as him recalculating his approach. My attorney thinks the omission of the second lot from the disclosure paperwork could be construed as concealment of a marital asset, he said, and now his voice had the flat, rehearsed quality of a man reading from notes his lawyer had prepared. I'd rather we handle that outside of court. There was no concealment, Richard. I didn't know that lot existed until 11 days ago. That's not going to matter much to a judge, is it? What matters is that it existed during the marriage and wasn't disclosed. Elena stood behind the counter of her mother's bakery, her mother's letter folded in her apron pocket, where she now kept it every single day, and she felt something in her chest that had been buried under 34 years of being told what mattered and what didn't. Send your lawyer's letter, Richard. I'll have mine ready. She didn't have a lawyer. She had $430 minus 11 days of supply costs, and a passbook she still hadn't touched, and a phone number Gus had given her for a man named Elias Farrow, who used to be a real estate attorney downstate before he retired to Ashford County to fish. She called him that afternoon. Elias came by the bakery in a flannel shirt with flour on his sleeve within the hour, because Gus had told him it was Rosalind's girl, and apparently that still meant something in this town even 6 years after Rosalind was gone. He read the deed, he read the will, he read the original 1999 purchase agreement for the corner lot, still in Rosalind's name alone, purchased 11 years before Elena even married Richard. This was never marital property, Elias said, not even close. Purchased before the marriage, held solely in your mother's name, passed to you by inheritance, never commingled, never improved with marital funds. Your ex-husband's attorney is bluffing on a claim that wouldn't survive a first motion. He sounded very sure of himself. He's supposed to sound sure of himself. That's the job. Doesn't mean the ground he's standing on is real. Elias set the papers down. You want my advice? Don't call him back. Let his letter come. I'll answer it. 2 things happened in the following week that Elena hadn't planned for. The first was that her daughter, Marisol, flew in from Chicago unannounced, walked into the bakery mid-morning rush, and stood in the doorway with an expression Elena hadn't seen on her face since she was a teenager catching her parents mid-argument. Dad called me, Marisol said. He said you're trying to hide assets from him. Your father is trying to take a piece of land your grandmother bought before he and I ever met. That's not what he said. I know it's not what he said. They stood there, mother and daughter, while Priya slid a tray of croissants into the case behind them, pretending very hard not to listen. Sit down, Elena said. Have a coffee, let me show you something. She brought Marisol behind the counter, pulled the letter from her apron pocket, and let her read it. She watched her daughter's face change 3 times while she read it, confusion, then something like anger, then something that broke a little at the edges. He told the divorce lawyers this place was worthless, Marisol said quietly. I remember him saying it at dinner. He laughed about it. I know. And Grandma just sat on this for 20 years because she didn't think anyone would believe her if she said what it was actually worth. Your grandmother learned a long time ago which men in her life were worth telling the truth to. Marisol didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she reached over the counter and took her mother's hand, and it was the first time in longer than Elena could remember that her daughter had reached for her first. "I sided with him during the divorce," Marisol said. "I thought you were being stubborn about the house. I'm sorry." "You didn't know what you didn't know." "I do now." The second thing that happened was the letter from Richard's attorney, which arrived 4 days later exactly as Elias predicted, full of language about equitable adjustment and undisclosed marital property, and Elias answered it within 48 hours with the original 1999 deed, Rosalind's will, and a 2-paragraph letter that ended with a single line Elena would remember for the rest of her life. Any further correspondence on this matter should be understood as harassment of a widow's estate and will be treated accordingly by the court. Richard's attorney did not respond in writing. Richard did. He showed up on a Tuesday morning, right in the middle of the breakfast rush, wearing the same navy blazer he used to wear to open houses, standing in the doorway like he expected the whole room to stop for him. A few regulars glanced up. Priya's hands went still over the register. Elena kept pulling a tray of scones from the oven because she had learned, over 34 years, exactly what it looked like when Richard wanted an audience, and she wasn't going to give him one for free. "Can we talk?" he said. "Not a question." "I've got a full case and a line, Richard. Talk here or don't talk." He glanced around at the customers, pretending not to listen, and something flickered across his face, the calculation of a man realizing the room wasn't his anymore. He lowered his voice instead. "This doesn't have to get ugly. I'm willing to walk away from the corner lot claim if you'll agree to a lump sum instead. Call it a courtesy for old time's sake." "There's no claim to walk away from. Elias already told your attorney that." "Elias Farrow, retired real estate counsel who fishes for a living. That's who you've got in your corner. He's the one whose letter your lawyer never answered." Richard's jaw tightened. For 34 years, that particular tightening had meant Elena was supposed to soften, to smooth it over, to find the version of the conversation that let him leave feeling like he'd won something. She set the tray down instead and untied her apron strings just enough to reach the folded letter she still kept there, though she didn't take it out. She didn't need to. She had it memorized by now. "You stood in a room and told a judge's clerk this place was a liability with a sentimental attachment," Elena said. "You didn't even think it was worth fighting for. And now that a developer wants it, suddenly it's worth flying out here and standing in my doorway during a breakfast rush. I was protecting both our interests at the time. I didn't know." "You didn't ask. There's a difference, Richard. You never asked what my mother built. You never asked what any of this was worth to me. You just decided, the way you always decided, and expected me to agree because agreeing was easier than fighting you." Her voice didn't rise. She'd spent 3 decades learning to keep it level around him, and old habits, it turned out, could still be useful even when the reason for them had changed. "I'm done agreeing." Richard looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, not quite defeat, but the particular tiredness of a man who has just realized the script he brought with him doesn't fit the room he's standing in. "Marisol thinks I'm the villain in this now," he said quietly. "Marisol thinks what the facts tell her to think. That's not my doing." He didn't have anything to say to that. He glanced once more around the bakery, the full case, the line still waiting, the sign glowing gold through the front window even in daylight, the name his own attorney had dismissed as worthless 6 months earlier. And he left without ordering anything, the bell over the door jingling behind him the way it had jingled for Rosalind's customers for 38 years, before Elena was the one standing behind the counter. Priya let out a breath she'd clearly been holding. "You want me to comp the next 10 customers just for good luck?" "Comp yourself a coffee," Elena said. "You earned it standing there looking terrifying on my behalf." Elias' letter went out that same week, and this time there was no reply at all, not a call, not a follow-up filing, not so much as a voicemail. Whatever calculation Richard's attorney had been running, it apparently didn't survive contact with a deed that predated the marriage by over a decade. 6 weeks after Elena stood on the curb watching movers carry out her mother's dining table, The developer's offer for the corner lot sat unsigned in a drawer because Elena had decided, after several long nights and one long conversation with Gus about what her mother would have wanted, that some things were worth more open than sold. She used part of the passbook money her mother had quietly built for over 2 decades without a single person in Elena's life knowing it existed, to expand the bakery into that corner lot instead. A proper seating area, a second oven, a part-time job for Priya's oldest, who was 16 and needed something to do after school that wasn't waiting around an empty apartment. Reopening happened on a Saturday in April, the whole block smelling like cinnamon and butter, half the town showing up because word moves fast in a place with 4 stoplights, and an old woman named Delphine, who used to buy bread from Rosalind every Sunday for 30 years, stood in front of the new sign, SWETWATEREST, 1985, REOPNED, and cried the same way Elena had cried on that overturned crate 6 weeks earlier. "Your mother would be so proud of you," Delphine said. "She already told me she would be," Elena said, and didn't explain, because some things you keep folded in your apron pocket and only share with the people who have earned it. Richard drove past the bakery once, weeks later, in the silver sedan he'd bought himself as a divorce present. He didn't stop. Elena was behind the counter when Priya nudged her and nodded toward the window. And Elena watched the car slow just slightly at the corner, long enough to see the crowd inside, the line out the door, the sign he'd once called a liability with a sentimental attachment, now glowing gold under a fresh coat of paint, before it sped back up and disappeared toward the highway. Elena didn't watch it go. She was already turning back to the oven, because there was a batch of her grandmother's crumb cake that needed pulling, and a line of customers who'd been waiting, and a life she was building one tray at a time that didn't need Richard Whitfield's opinion to be worth something. If Elena's story moved you even half as much as it moved me writing it, do 3 things before you go, like this video. Drop a comment with the one line from this story that hit you hardest, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one, because there is always another story of someone who got underestimated and came back stronger than anyone thought possible. I'll see you in the next one.